I loved your idea that merit is the unifying idea in America. It seems to me, at any rate, anyone who doesn't guess from my accent knows I'm not from these shores. It seems to me, at any rate, that this is still prevalent in America to a greater degree than it is in Europe, for instance. The idea that achievement is not a zero-sum game, and if this guy makes some money, it's not to my detriment, it's to everyone's advantage. So I love the idea that merit is a unifying idea in this country. We have a very concrete case coming up, which is, of course, the Harvard admissions case. I was at Harvard the other week and was gathering that it seems like the Supreme Court will probably issue its verdict on this before the summer recess. If, as a lot of people think, Harvard is found to have been doing something illegal, then almost every institution of higher education in America will have been found to have been over the same line. What do you think happens if the verdict does indeed go that way?
So if I were on the board of a university, and I'm not currently on the board of a university, I think it would be financially irresponsible if you weren't setting aside some reserve for litigation right now. And I think that's going to be a good thing in disciplining as a function these universities that have engaged in systematic discrimination of a kind that history will judge very poorly. It is an ugly form of discrimination. Not that different. In Harvard, it's my alma mater, so I'll be gloves off in my criticism. What they did to Jews 50 years ago that they'll apologize for today, that is what they're doing actively today. The effect is on Asian Americans. History will not judge that kindly, and I think that that's going to come with real legal teeth and consequences, and their, accountability, I think, is a precondition for justice. And so I think that accountability is going to come in the form of a wave of lawsuits that these universities should set aside or reserve for. I think that'll actually even be good because it's going to put more financial pressure on an educational industrial complex that itself should be called out, including with the Department of Education here lurking behind the scenes, artificially subsidizing four-year college education institutions that have become this corrupt. So I hope, actually, I'm rooting for a form of creative destruction here, that this unleashes a wave of, and you want to do the math on this, these liabilities can be quite uncapped, that actually financially punish universities for engaging in the kinds of behaviors they have. That financial accountability then triggers revealing the way in which the entire system was based actually on a large farce of the value and the inflated value and subsidized value, artificially subsidized value for your college education that really delivers a much needed reckoning to higher education itself. That's what I'm rooting for, and I can tell you, I'm not just going to be passively rooting for it. In whatever capacity I'm in, 2 years from now, I think that there's ways we can use this finally to deliver the wake-up call to fixing a broken higher education system in this country.
Yes, it does seem that, it's been an enormous boon to the HR departments, all of this.
Of course it is.
Stanford, which had such a fine reputation until recent weeks, Stanford, it turned out there is roughly one HR person on staff, on faculty, for every student. It would be cheaper to get everyone a butler. And much more useful. And it would make me want to go to Stanford. But one of the great scandals that has to be addressed in this country is how you have people coming out of university in ever more debt, paying for these vast bureaucracies of bureaucrats, and every year, year on year, being stupider and stupider. Something has to give at some point, does it not?
It does. I think you've put your finger on the right pulse. It is not an accident that this correlates with rise in college tuition, actually.
Yeah.
So in Woke Inc., my first book, I cited this at Michigan State, but may as well have been many other universities too. There's been an order of magnitude, so 10x, explosion in the ratio of administrative staff to students. And so the rise of this managerial bureaucracy is part of what creates this anti-meritocratic force in all of our institutions, by the way. I talked about it in government, right? The administrative state does to government what the managerial class does to the university. What increasingly you see happening in the HR ranks of corporate America too. Now, there's a linkage between these things. Okay, so Lyndon Johnson set into motion the Great Society, which is the biggest misnomer in I think, American history for what it's done for even the very people it was supposed to protect, in many cases black Americans. But one of the things he set into motion was the executive order that created affirmative action in America. By the way, if a US president can create it by executive order, you can end it by executive order. We need to remember that and hold Republicans accountable for that. But here's actually what happened, is with the civil rights statutes, we ended up protecting attributes like race and gender and sexual orientation now. Now, how does that relate to some of the other travails we see in America? It goes back to actually the anti-meritocratic culture even creates an assault on free speech. I can tell you on how that happens both in universities and in corporate America, where now those statutes are read so broadly that if you now say something that's even, it's not even just about anti-meritocratic hiring, if you say something that is deemed to be hostile to or experienced as hostile by a member of a protected class, that is creating a hostile work environment. That's what these HR deputies are there to police. They're even legally required to it. And so if they allow that person to speak in a way that creates a hostile work environment for someone who's a member of a protected class, then that could be a basis for a Title VII violation or a civil rights violation under the civil rights statutes. Well, what does that mean? We've created the very conditions then for viewpoint discrimination while leaving political expression itself unprotected. And so these concepts between the assault on free speech, which itself is part of a meritocracy of ideas, is actually deeply related to the assault on merit in hiring itself, and the managerial bureaucracy that administers the latter is actually responsible for creating the anti-speech conditions in the former. And so it's not an accident. People wonder, why do we see these malaises rise at the same time? You think free speech culture assault and cancel culture is over here, and anti-meritocratic stuff and affirmative action and DEI bureaucracies are over here. No. It's not a coincidence. These are deeply linked, and if we get to that root cause with an affirmative alternative vision of our own, then we can stand on strong moral and principled footing to not only gut that system, but create a new one to take its place.
Let me lead us on to what's perhaps one of the most awkward parts of this conversation, which is we talk most of the time in discussions about meritocracy about the people who can and the people who can succeed. Of course, in any society, but particularly in a democracy like America, you have a flip side of that problem. You said, I was very struck by it, hardship is not the same thing as victimhood. I couldn't agree more, but we do live in a society in which victimhood is the main goal. To be a victim and to be on the victim hierarchy, to have the delicious opportunity to be the most victimized person is clearly the aspiration. We've all seen it in our lives when people pick up the microphone in a Q&A and they say, speaking as, and I think, everything that's going to come afterwards is going to be garbage. And then they'll say something about their lived experience, as if there's any other kind of experience. Sort of, in my unlived experience. But we do have this problem, particularly in America, that the seeking of victimhood in our own lifetimes, and you wrote about this obviously in both of your books, but in our own lifetimes we've moved, in America in particular, which is so striking, from a culture of heroism to a culture of victimhood. And if I can lay out very quickly, there's one particular problem in this, in a democracy, which is something which I quote Nietzsche a little bit in my most recent book, in The War on the West, and whenever a student says to me that they're a fan of Nietzsche, I always say, oh yeah, which bits? You've got to think it's worth using carefully. But I used rather carefully Nietzsche's work on the genealogy of morals for my last book, and there's one particular insight of his that really struck me and is pertinent to our situation and to our discussion today, which is this. Nietzsche talks about the type of person who, he says, a person of resentment, who among other things, and see if anyone can recognize this type in the society we're now in, among other things, tears, he says, at wounds long since healed and then cries about their hurt. Now, Nietzsche says there's one particular problem, which is that the person of resentment needs somebody to stand over their lives and make a correction. But it's not even clear to Nietzsche who that person should be. It's not clear to me who it should be. Nietzsche ends up talking about the person as maybe being a secular priest, is the term he uses, quite an interesting term. But he says that somebody must stand over the life of the person of resentment and say to them at some point, you are right. You have reason to be resentful. There is somebody who has ruined your life. There is somebody who has held you back. The person is you. Now, that is probably the least pleasant thing to hear, and probably one of the hardest things to ever say. How can a politician, should a politician, say to certain people, you know, you have screwed up your life, and it's been your responsibility and your fault. You could turn it around, but if you don't want to, you'll still be the only person to blame.
I think here's how I would say it. It is still in your power to turn it around, but that is your choice to make. I think hardship is not a choice. Victimhood is a choice.
Yes.
And the best a politician can do, certainly a president can do, is at least to create the conditions in a country where we don't create the incentives for people to choose victimhood. And so would I, if I'm speaking as a national leader here, would I point to the person and say it is your fault? I would say it the other way. I think it is our fault for creating a culture, including the economic incentives that backstop it, for you to make the choice that you are making today, to be a victim rather than to be a victor, okay? Now, we will do our part and fix that on the expectation that you will then do yours. And I think that is the kernel, thank you, for a national revival in this country. I think it makes the difference. That single trade will make the difference of whether we are Rome, or more likely, look at how long we've been alive as a country, more likely whether we are Carthage, or whether we're just a little young, going through our version of adolescence. Adolescence is a period where, even absent those government incentives, there's something about adolescence that makes you want to see yourself as a victim of your parents, of your conditions, of your high school peers, right? There's something about this is woven into nature, too. It's not just a governmental citizenry relationship. It's something within each of us. Well, we're going through that version of adolescence as a nation right now. And I think in the good version of this, where we have leaders that are willing to change that incentive structure and to boldly look their citizenry in the eye and speak that hard truth back to them, set the expectation of what we expect of citizens. The idea of being a citizen entailing a duty. Part of that duty is to look within, not to blame the other, but ask about what I can do myself. Well, if we're able to do that, then I think as a nation itself, we will, too, get through our version of adolescence and be stronger on the other side of it, as there were many rises and many falls of Rome. Actually, that's one of the secrets of history. There was no one rise and fall of Rome. There were many rises and many falls. I think we may still be ahead of the next rise in the American experiment. I truly believe that. I think it depends on the leaders who we have who are willing to speak that hard truth.
I'm so glad that you said that about adolescence in America. It comes much better from your mouth than from mine. I was brought up to believe, as Jessica Mitford once said, we weren't taught much about American history in Britain. What we were taught was that basically the Americans had done something unspeakable in the 18th century, and we preferred not to talk about it. Very embarrassing for them. But let me just, two points that we really should hit on before we wrap up. The first, let me bring us onto a sort of metaphysical point before I bring us onto a more practical one. Metaphysical point is this. You mentioned the issue of free speech a couple of times. It seems to me that the great problem that exists in that regard in America is that we've lost confidence in the idea that free speech leads to truth.
Yes.
Because we've lost the idea of truth. We've lost the idea that this battle of ideas, this knocking of stone on flint refines things. You get to the point. It seems as though we're actually trying to avoid the point. As though, I mean, look at all of the words that the modern academy has used. Problematize, an extraordinarily ugly word. We have problematized a lot of things. Fantastic. Have you answered anything? Not yet. We have created problems that didn't exist 20 years ago and are endlessly going to fiddle with them. But the idea that we need speech, we need inquiry, because we will get to a truth, and that truth exists, seems to be one of the underlying things that has fallen away.
I agree with you. You're right over the flame with truth, actually, and the rejection of truth. Now, I think this puts pressure, helpfully, on the partisan political framework through which we're taught to see the actual divides in this country. Because where you began, Douglas, in your remarks, when you were speaking, was actually on the idea that the left and the right differ on how to achieve a world in which those who are endowed with whatever their talent is are permitted to achieve it. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that, but there's also a strain in this country that rejects that as an objective in its own right, that doesn't disagree about the means, but disagrees about the end itself. And so it's actually, though I run for president as a Republican, it's the least important part of it is that label. I think that it puts pressure on us to revise, to update the actual political divide in our country, which is not between Republicans and Democrats. These labels have come out to mean hollowed out husks of themselves. On the left, there's the divide you just talked about. On the right, there's an increasing strain of victimhood itself, right? It's a victimhood culture that's spread in many different directions. Let's for a moment dissolve that distinction and see this through a different lens itself of, the way I'll describe it simply is, are you pro-American or anti-American? But what does that mean? It means, are you pro-truth? Do you believe in the existence of an objective truth? And then we can disagree about the details of how we get there, but do we agree on that basic end, or do we not? And I think that there's a good 20-25% of this country that does not, but at least we can then see that with clarity and smoke that out, rather than talking about Republicans and Democrats. Do you then believe in merit, or do you not? And the optimistic note with which I'll end that is, I think that's not a 50-50 divide in this country. That's something like a 75-25, maybe 80-20 divide, which means that if in the conservative movement we make the next election in 2024, like Reagan in some ways did in 1980, about that underlying actual reality, could be a landslide election and probably the most unifying thing we could deliver to a country that's in bad need of it. But that's, I think, the prism. We have to take off the goggles of partisan politics to actually see that reality. That's the real fissure at the heart of the American politic, not some sort of artificial retrofitted partisan distinction.
The clock is running down, but let's finish on an easy question. What should we be doing with our lives?
Okay, all right. I was waiting. So look, I think that I'll end it in equally lighthearted tone. When I wake up to a country right now, especially my generation, especially younger, I feel like we're like bats. We're like blind bats, lost in a cave, lost in some abyss. We always have been in some ways, but we send out a signal. How does a bat figure out where it is in that cave? It doesn't see it with its own eyes. Sends out sonar, echolocation, and it bounces off something that is true, okay? The fact that I'm a citizen of a nation. The fact that I am a member of this family with two parents who brought me into this world. The fact that I believe in this true God. The fact that I worked hard and created something true in the world. We send out these signals, faith, patriotism, hard work, family, and then it bounces back and it says, okay, I derive my identity from these things. This is where I am. I'm not lost this is my location. And I think today the moment we live in is one where we send out those signals, but then nothing comes back. Faith is gone. Patriotism is gone. Hard work has basically disappeared. The idea of family has receded. And so then we're lost in that abyss. And so I think what do we do for rediscovering that purpose of life? I think we have to recreate those pillars of truth, that when we send out those signals desperately as we do, that something actually does come back and teach us who we really are, so that we're not lost in the desert. And I'll close with this version of it. I'm not a biblical scholar or anything, but the book of Exodus, when the Israelites are lost in the desert, it is when they are lost and cannot see where they are in that desert that they then say, let me go back and be ruled by that Pharaoh that we escaped. And I think that we can complain about big government all we want. The question is actually take that look in the mirror and ask ourselves, what is it that makes us want to bend that knee? It is the fact that we are lost, and the task ahead is, can we find ourselves in that desert? I think we can.
Yes,
but
King Charles is still willing and eager.
He's open for business.
To accept if you do decide to bend the knee. Let me finish, apart from saying thank you to Vivek, by making one very quick reflection of my own on this. It seems to me that we've, among other things, fallen into a listlessness because we've given ourselves a task that is impossible and told us it is the purpose. We've told ourselves that endless diversity, inclusion, equity, that everything ending up the same is the purpose. And it's impossible. It's being invited to play a game that cannot be won in this life. And so I submit, in that case, you don't play the game. But it's a powerful invitation which is being put out there to young people because it gives them purpose and much more. Let me finish, since you made a biblical reference, let me make a quasi-religious one. One of the things I hear very often, I've just finished speaking at various universities in the South, and one of the things I hear very often is the conditions are not optimal at the moment. And you can argue that, for instance, there's no reason why somebody should be a capitalist if they cannot accrue capital. It's extremely hard to get onto the housing ladder, much more. Many people have large amounts of student debt, etc., etc., etc. My point has repeatedly been to say to students and others, to young Americans, but the conditions never were optimal. One of my favorite sermons was given by C.S. Lewis in October 1939 at the University Church in Oxford. And C.S. Lewis said there, he said, the conditions we find ourselves in are certainly not optimal. That's some British understatement for you. He said they're certainly not optimal. But he said the search for truth and beauty must persist in any case. He says if human beings had put off the search for these things until the conditions were right, the search would never have begun. And as he says, and maybe I'll close on this, as he says in that sermon, he says, the ants have found their own arrangements and presumably have their own pleasure from it. They've decided to accrue some food and a colony. And he says, but we human beings are different. And he gives the most beautiful list. He says, we discuss mathematical theorems in beleaguered cells. We discuss the latest poem whilst marching on the walls of Quebec. We make jokes on scaffolds and comb our hair at the gates of Thermopylae. This is not panache, it's our nature. I'd love it if more young Americans realized that. But in any case, Vivek, it's been a great pleasure. Good luck. I'm rooting for you, and I'm still going to hold you to that promise.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone.